My function here tonight is purely ceremonial. The occasion justifies a few ritualistic syllables of celebration, for it marks the launching of a series of 10 poetry readings at the Guggenheim Museum under the sponsorship of the Academy of American Poets, which I am moved to say is a far more adventurous and free-hearted enterprise than that official appellation might suggest. Can you all hear me, by the way? All of us in the arts dream fondly, which used to mean foolishly, of a friendly community of the arts. And it is in fact possible in this city, as nowhere else in America, to have at least some intimation of the excitement and satisfactions of such a fellowship, particularly among painters and poets. Some even dare to think of trying marriage. The present arrangement between the poets in this museum can scarcely be called a marriage, but it may accurately be described, I hope, as a beginning of what promises to be a most enjoyable affair. If this society of ours made any sense whatever in cultural terms, all of Frank Lloyd Wright's marvelous ramps would not be capacious enough to hold the thousands swarming to hear the poets we are so lucky to have with us tonight. Robert Lowell and John Berryman are two poets in their 40s who have most clearly demonstrated their authority, their force, their inventiveness, and their staying power. The last is rather important. They are poets who have already escaped from their generation and who belong to literature. They are voices to whom other poets listen, which is no mean tribute. John Berryman was born in Oklahoma, far from the New England of the vested Lowells. His most celebrated work to date is Homage to Mistress Bradstreet, a long poem that in its strangeness and power and nervosity stays alive, as do few modern poems of comparable length since The Wasteland and The Bridge. For several years, he has been a kind of underground poet, the kind you hear digging, at work on a sequence that I can only describe as indescribable. You'll soon be listening to it, and which will be published shortly as 76 Dream Songs. 2 hours ago I thought it was 75, but I've just been told it's 76. I have a hunch that the protagonist who walks through these poems, or should I say stumbles, jerks, freezes, jumps, a man the poet calls Henry, is going to be with us a long time. There's recently been published in England an anthology of the Penguin poets entitled The New Poetry, selected and introduced by A. Alvarez, a British critic with whom I don't always agree. But in this case, it is of interest, certainly, and coincidental that the only two American poets whom he feels worthy of consorting with his British penguins are Mr. Lowell and Mr. Berryman. And this is what Mr. Alvarez says about them. He's reviewing the poetry of the 40s and before. And he says a whole school of criticism was developed to prove technically that there was no necessary or even significant connection between art and its root in the artist's life. During the 40s, however, when English poetry was at its nadir, there arose in the States a new generation of poets, the most important of whom were Robert Lowell and John Berryman. They had assimilated the lesson of Eliot and the critical 30s. They assumed that a poet, to earn his title, had to be very skillful, very original, and very intelligent. But they were no longer concerned with Eliot's rearguard action against the late Romantics. They were, I mean, no longer adherents of the cult of rigid impersonality. So they were able to write poetry of immense skill and intelligence, which coped openly with the quick of their experience sometimes on the edge of disintegration and breakdown. I hope that nobody gets the impression, despite Alvarez and despite tonight's pairing, that these two poets constitute some sort of team. Actually, they don't think alike, write alike, or sound alike. I'm even tempted to add they don't even feel alike, but that might be misconstrued. But anyhow, I'm duly grateful for their differences. One of each is glorious. Mr. Lowell will read his poems first. There will be a short intermission, some 15 minutes or so, during which you can have coffee, smoke in the cafeteria, after which Mr. Berryman will read his poems without introduction. Thank you very much. I've already said everything I have to say this evening except 3 words. Mr. John Berryman.
Thank you for that strong applause. I'm going to ignore Mr. Lowell's remarks. He seems to have constituted himself this evening as sort of a cheering section. We don't want to have a mutual admiration society, let me put it that way. So I'll have something to say about him later. Mr. Kunitz, I'll deal with in private. The program is extremely simple. First, I'm going to tell you a story, and not true. And then I'll read a section, well, one stanza from an unfinished poem. Then I'll read you a stanza from a finished poem. And then I'll read you some sections from another unfinished poem. Then we'll wind up for the night. Isn't that the most unappetizing program you ever heard of? I've been listening closely with all 4 ears to Mr. Kunitz and Mr. Lowell, and I didn't hear that they ever said anything about poetic diction. Now, why should they? Well, the reason they should is because Mrs. Craig, who is minding this series, asked me repeatedly by long-distance telephone to talk about poetic diction, which is supposed to be our theme this evening. Well, I don't believe in themes. For poetry readings, they're hard enough on their own. Besides, I'm not teaching this year. But, rebellious, still I'm very obedient, so I prepared some remarks about poetic diction. And you know what? I plan to give them. We start with the story. It's rather strange. I haven't given a reading in New York for about 12 years, I would say. And the place is crawling with my relatives, friends, enemies, neutrals. Also, this is the eve of one of the great and ancient Western festivals in a building of which, on the whole, the less said the better. So it sort of makes you think. So I'll tell you a Halloween story. This took place according to, I don't like the word legend, but I don't know where else to go. 2 years ago, in a Middle Western city called Minneapolis, which I at present inhabit, on the whole. It's about a big banker, but a really big banker, a complete and absolute jerk. And on Halloween, he prides himself on his good doing, you know. And on Halloween, he had his butler get a basket of apples, big red ones. And then he had the butler polish them apples. And then he had this basket of them apples put by the door. Then he sit down by his fire and wait to do good. And he answered the door himself. And pretty soon comes a scratch, I don't know what. And he goes to the door, it's a tot. And he looked down at that tot. And the tot look up at him and he say, trick or treat. The banker, he reach into the basket and out he take a vast apple, brilliantly polished. And he drop into the, you know, the paper bag of the tot. And the tot look into the bag, and then he look up at the banker. And he say, you big shit, you've broken my apple, my cookie. I ruined the story. Sorry. I ruined the story. Well, I think we can easily work out, since we are not here in the Yale Graduate School, a theory of diction from this story. Jokes very much like poems and vice versa. Diction, which is nothing but sort of choice of a kind of language, meaning rejection of other kinds of language, ought to be decorous. That is, it ought to be appropriate to the subject. But some subjects, how can you be appropriate to? That is to say, the tot is appropriate, in my opinion. It may seem extravagant on his part to say this. Chairman of the board, First National. But on the whole, it's appropriate. Now, the situations that we come on in poetry are generally extravagant. Problems. Namely, do you try to fit a diction to a situation, or do you take account of the ridiculous and grotesque, horrible, delicious aspects of the situation? No. So now I'm running through a series of problems. 15 years ago, I have nothing better to do. I was working on a poem called Scholars of the Orchid Pavilion. It's in 7-line stanzas. The scene is heaven. The main speaker, in fact the only speaker in this one, is a sage called Matsu. The Chinese don't believe in heaven, you understand that. And they have group therapy, let's put it that way. This stanza goes, the poem is unfinished. Sozzled, Matsu, after a silence, vouchsafed a word alarming. We must love them all. Affronted, the fathers jumped. Yes, he went madly on and waved in quest of his own dreadful subject. Oh, the fathers, he cried, must not be all. Whereon upon consent we broke up for the day. So here's a problem in diction. I'm not going to investigate this since I'm not trying to teach anything tonight. This is, I would say, a conventional modern situation in diction. We have sozzled, fighting with vouchsafed, all right, at the end of the same line. My point is this, that this diction, as of 1948, would hardly have done for a little problem that I confronted in a long poem called Humph, Mistress Bradstreet, About 5 years later. That's about 10 years ago. My problem is easily stated. There was an imaginary conversation taking place between the 20th century poet, not to be confused with me, and the 17th century poetess, a very bad poetess, and Bradstreet. And they seem to be physically in congruence somewhere, and he is giving her a hard time, so to speak. And so, how many times has one heard this remark? Every time you give a woman a hard time, pretty soon she says, "Talk to me." So she says at the end of one stanza, "Talk to me." So he talks to her. This is stanza 31. Wait a minute. She says, "Talk to me." So he does, or rather he sings to her. He says, "I'm interested in the idea that the counterpoint between sozzled and vouchsafed wouldn't quite do here. It is spring's New England. Pussy willows wedge up in the wet, milky crestings, fringed yellow in heaven, eyed by the melting hand in hand, or mere desirings, single, heavy-footed, rapt, make surge poor human hearts. Venus is trapped, the hefty pike shifts sheer, in Orion blazing. Warblings, odors, nudge to an edge. Well, that's rather elaborate. The style that I was using in the Chinese poem wouldn't do for that, and that style wouldn't do for the poem that I've been working on for the last 8 years, I guess, which is about a man named Henry. Now, I don't think we could have either this stanza or that stanza about a man named Henry. Henry has a hard time. People don't like him, and he doesn't like himself. In fact, he doesn't even know what his name is. His name at one point seems to be Henry House, and at another point it seems to be Henry Pussycat, and at other points he has a friend. Some of the songs are dialogues. His friend calls him Mr. Bones, and I use friend in quotation marks. This is one of the most hostile friends who ever lived. I'll read you some of the sections, and then we'll knock off. The critical point, although I wouldn't call it critical, or much less hortatory, is the mutual inconsistencies. Style. Can you all hear me all right? I don't like these things. Can I put them on? Well, maybe I better put it on, because some of these songs have to be pretty quiet. Pretty quiet. I'm not reading them in the order in which they occur in the manuscript. I've made some changes because of the difference between reading privately and reading in public. But this is the first one, though. And in it, the I in poetry, you know, the personal pronouns, never the poet. But even here, it's even less so than usual, and modulates immediately into Henry. And when we come to some of Henry's religious and political opinions, I must remind you that not only is it not me, it's not even Henry. He's sleeping. The name of this work is Dream Songs. And my friends have been budging me, so 76 are going to be published in the spring. Or, well, I'll tell you more later. Here's number one. Huffy Henry hid the day. Unappeasable Henry sulked. My Sears point, trying to put things over. It was the thought that they thought they could do it. Made Henry wicked and away. But he should have come out and talked. All the world, like a woolen lover, once did seem on Henry's side. And then came a departure. And thereafter, nothing fell out as it might or ought. I don't see how Henry, pried open for all the world to see, survived. What he has now to say is a long wonder the world can bear and be. Once in a sycamore I was glad all at the top, and I sang, hard on the land wears the strong sea, and empty grows every bed. The poem is rather long. There are several hundred sections, of which about 70, I guess, have been printed. But the sections are short. There are 3 6-line stanzas on the whole. Some have titles, that doesn't, and some are dedicated. This both has a title and is dedicated. This next one is called The Prisoner of Shark Island, with Paul Muni. All in caps, like a marquee. And it's dedicated to Robert Giroux, who, among other claims to our attention and esteem, used to be a film critic for The Nation, and pointed out to me in due course that The Prisoner of Shark Island, as a matter of fact, did not have Paul Muni in it, but Warner Baxter. So I said, so what? Henry is dreaming. Mr. Giroux, who is here this evening, and I once saw 7 Dietrich films in one day. How's that? I've never had a chance to mention that before. Anyway, The Prisoner of Shark Island with Paul Muni. Henry is old, for Henry remembers Mr. Deed's tuba and the cameo. And The Race in Ben-Hur, that's the other one. The Lost World with sound. And The Men from Blankley's, which he did not dig. Nor did he understand one caption of. Bewildered Henry, while the big ones laughed. That's the first stanza. Now, Henry is unmistakably a big one. Funny, he don't feel so. He just stuck around. The German and the Russian films into Italian and Japanese films turned, and many were prevented from making it. He wishing he could squirm again where Hoot is just ahead of Rustlers, where William S. forgoes some deep advantage and moves on, where Hashknife Hartley, having the matter taped, the rats are flying, for the rats have moved in mostly, and this is for real. The scene of this next one, about which I'll tell you something afterward, is a posh restaurant. Henry has a tendency to talk about himself in the third person, by the way. I can't help that. I once met a lady at a tea in London who, my hostess would say to her, "What did you do this morning, Phoebe?" And she'd say, well, Phoebe was downtown. There is a rejection of the integrity of the personality. So sometimes he talks about himself in the second person, sometimes in the third, and sometimes in the first. Filling her compact and delicious body with chicken paprika, she glanced at me twice, fainting with interest. My hungered back meant only the fact of her husband and 4 other people, kept me from springing on her or falling at her little feet and crying, "You are the hottest one for years of night." Henry's dazed eyes have enjoyed brilliance. My advance upon despairing my spumoni. Now, here comes his friend. Sir Bones is stuffed the world with feeding girls, but Henry hadn't heard. Black hair, complexion Latin, jeweled eyes downcast, the slob beside her feasts. What wonders is she sitting on over there? The restaurant buzzes. She might as well be on Mars. Where did it all go wrong? There ought to be a law against Henry. Mr. Bones, there is. This was printed in the Weekly last winter. And a letter came to the publisher from a pillar of the community in some hole upstate New York. And among other things, he said, is it true that the New Republic is still read in high schools? Well, the publisher passed the letter on to the literary editor, who was delighted, and passed it on to me, saying it's the first letter they've ever had from anybody about their poetry. Yeah, in the next one, Henry seems to be on a long trip. The first stanza takes place in New York. Second stanza takes place over Mount Athos, which is the peninsula in northeastern Greece, dedicated to the Virgin for the last 1,000 years. And the third stanza takes place in India. Henry sat in the bar and was odd, off in the glass, from the glass. I'm at odds with the world and its God. His wife is a complete nothing. St. Stephen getting even. Henry sat in the plane and was gay. Careful, Henry, nothing said aloud, but where a virgin out of cloud to her mountain dropped in light, his thought made pockets and the plane bucked. Pardon me, lady. All right. I'm very fond of the spelling of all right. I did it O-R-R-I-G-H, like that. Henry lay in the netting, wild, while the brain fever bird did scales. There is such a bird. Mr. Heartbreak, the new man, come to farm a crazy land. An image of the dead on the fingernail of a newborn child. I've been trying to instruct people through the public prints and radio and other media for quite a while that leaving apart the very senior people like Mr. Frost, now dead, and Ezra Pound, the two finest working American poets were Mr. Lowell and Theodore Retke. And lots of people agree with me about that, so that the recent death of Retke sort of diminished our stock. And both his colleagues and his friends, we had to feel very bad. The next song is called A Strut for Retke. Westward, hit a low note. For a roar lost across the sound, but north from Bremerton, hit a way down note. And never cadenza again of flowers, of course. Him who could really do that cleared his throat and staggered on. The bluebells, pool shallows, saluted his overknees, while the clouds growled, and snapped and crashed. No stunt he'll ever unflinch once more will fail. Oh, lucky fellow, eh, Bones? Drifted off upstairs, downstairs, somewheres. No more daily, trying to hit the head on the nail. Thirstless, without a think in his head. Back from wherever, with it said. Hit a high long note for a lover found, needing a lower into friendlier ground, to bug among worms no more, around our jungles where our splurt, what for? Weeds, too, he favored as most men don't favor men. The garden master's gone. I'll read you a very gloomy one. And there sat down once a thing on Henry's heart, so heavy. If he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good. Starts again, always in Henry's ears, a little cough somewhere, an odor, a chime. And there is another thing he has in mind. Like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind. All the bells say, too late. This is not for tears, thinking. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone and hack their body off and hide the pieces of where they may be found. He knows. He went over everyone and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn, the mob. Nobody is ever missing. Next one is called Snowline. And I thought Mr. Lowell's remarks about my obscurity were rather obscure. But it is a terrible fact that what the advertising people would call one of my main British outlets has suddenly only wants, they take my songs and hold them a year or so, you know, But then they have to get a critic to write about them. And with them, it's a bad. So maybe they're obscure. So I'll give away this one, all right? It's about a sheep. A lost sheep. He feels bad, this sheep. It's a religious poem. The snow line. That's bad. Henry as a sheep. It was wet and white and swift, and where I am, I don't know. It was dark, and then it isn't. I wish the barker would come. There seems to be to eat nothing. I am unusually tired. I'm alone, too. If only the strange one with so few legs would come, I'd say my prayers out of my mouth, as usual. Where are his notes I loved? There may be horribles. It's hard to tell. The barker nips me, but somehow I feel he too is on my side. I'm too alone. I see no end. If we could all run, even that would be better. I am hungry. The sun is not hot. It's not a good position I am in. If I had to do the whole thing over again, I wouldn't. Seeing the next one is a cocktail party inhabited by people whom I was once having a conversation with a person whom I will refer to as Edmund Wilson. And we were talking about a mutual friend, and he described her as an international cocktail bitch, which I think is pretty good. I better tell you, there's an allusion here to Shialda Station, which is the immense and terrible station in Calcutta. The terminus for refugees from East Bengal, where they live until they die. Henry's pelt was put on sundry walls where it did much resemble Henry, and them persons was delighted, especially his long and glowing tail. By all them was admired, and the visitors, they whistled. This is it. Golden, whilst your frozen daiquiris, where at midnight gleams on you his fur and silky and black. A mission accomplished, well. My molten yellow and moonless bag, drained, hangs at rest. Collect in the cold depths, barracuda. I, in Shialda Station, some possessionless children survive to die. The Chinese communes hum. 2 daiquiris withdrew into a corner of the gorgeous room, and one told the other a lie. Then things are going rather long here. Leave out some. I mean, some more. This appears to be a political one, but don't forget it's Henry, it's not me. And Henry is sound asleep. He's not responsible for his opinion. This is called The Lay of Ike, and is about an almost forgotten public personality. I had a little trouble about this. I had to censor it at the Library of Congress because I figure Eisenhower's lawyers are better than mine. And I also censored it on the third program of the BBC, but at Harvard I got carried away and read the whole thing, so I don't know what I'm going to do tonight. This has a title. It's called The Lay of Ike. How straightforward can you get? That's already a critical remark. This is the lay of Ike. Here's to the glory of the great white auk who has been running things in recent act in the United. If your screen is black, ladies and gentlemen, I like, at the point he was already terrific, sick to a second term, having done no wrong, no right, having let the army defend itself from Joe, let venom straws bile Oppenheimer out of use, used Robb, who later fend for Goldfein, breaking no laws. He lay in the White House, Saab, who never understood his own strategy, so Money's memoirs, nor any strategy, wanting the ball bulled through all parts of the line at once, proving by his refusal to take Berlin he misread even Clausewitz, wide, empty grin that never lost a vote. Oh, Adlai mine. Next one is dedicated to a philosopher, a friend of mine named Ralph Ross. Henry seems to be traveling. The greens of the Ganges Delta foliate of heartless youth made late aware, he pled brownies, please come. To Henry, in his sparest times, sometimes the little people spread and did friendly things. Then he was glad, pleased at the worst. Except with men, he shook brightest winter sun. Oh, the green lives of the great delta, ours, hurt his migrant heart in a safety of the steady plain. Please, please, come. My friends, he has been known to mourn. I'll die, live you, in the most wild, kindly, green, partly forgiving wood, sort of forever. And all those human things, close not your better ears to tell, while good spring returns with a dance and sigh. I'll read two more, and I think I will do it. Next one of those I left out. Well, I can't find it. This one is dedicated to Saul Bellow. Turning it over, considering like a madman, Henry put forth a book. No harm resulted from this. Neither the menstruating stars nor man was moved at once. Bear dogs drew closer for a second look and performed their friendly operations there. Refreshed, the bark rejoiced. Seasons went and came. Leaves fell, but only a few. Something remarkable about this unshedding, bulky, bold, proud, blue-green, moist thing made by savage and thoughtful surviving Henry began to strike the passers from despair, so that sore on their shoulders, old men hoisted 6-foot suns, and polished women called small girls to dream a while toward the flashing and bursting tree. This will be the last one here. No, I'll read you one. I'll read you two more. Would you like to hear about his conversation with St. Peter? This takes place just after his death. Just after. He says, Peter's not friendly. He gives me sideways looks. And the architecture is far from reassuring. I feel uneasy. Pity. The interview began so well. I mentioned fiendish things. He waved them away and poured me a martini, strangely needed. We spoke of indifferent matters, God's health, the vague hell of the Congo, John's energy. This was written several years ago. Antimatter. I felt fine. Then a change came backward. A chill fell, talk slackened, died, and he began to give me sideways looks. Christ, I thought, what now? And would have asked for another, but didn't dare. I feel my application failing. It's growing dark. Some other sound is overcoming. His last words are, "We betrayed me." And the last one, I'm happy to say, is better natured than that. Just a little. Henry is in high spirits in this one for the first time in his entire history. It's because it's the last one. That's number 76. According to, the computers are always. A seedy Henry rose up shy and de-walled and shaved and swung his barbells, duted Henry up, and PA'd 4,000 of persons on topics of grand moment to Henry, are to those less and none. With a book of his in either hand, he is stripped down to move on. Henry is tired of the winter and haircuts and a squeamish, comfy, ruin-prone, proud national mind and spring in the city so cold. Henry likes fall. He would be prepared to live in a world of fall forever, impenitent Henry. But the snows and summers grieve and dream. These fierce and airy occupations and love raved away so many of Henry's years. It is a wonder that with in each hand one of his own mad books and all, Ancient Fires for Eyes, his head full and his heart full, he's making ready to move on. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.